Well, first of all, I'd like to thank BOSIS and Lord Hussain for inviting me here today. I think it's an important topic. We've heard a rather illustrious description of me earlier on. I know a number of people on the panel here with me. Good to sit here with you. I feel honoured to be in your company. This is an important topic. Representation and reality is the title given. When I see that heading, I think of an acronym that was once defined to me, FAIR, F-E-A-R, standing for false evidence appearing real. And I think it's quite apt, because I think that a word at the centre of this debate is the word of suspicion. Professor Paddy Hilliard, an Northern Irish professor, wrote a book during the 70s and 80s called The Suspect Communities, and he was referring to the Northern Irish communities in Britain, or mainland Britain, in the aftermath of the IRA bombing campaign and the crude process that affected them in the way they were treated and the way they were treated with absolute suspicion. And he went on to say, some years later, that the new suspect community was the Muslim community. People like Peter Oborne, who I heard through the grapevine might be joining us later, raised this issue some years ago with a Dispatches documentary that some of you may have seen on Channel 4. When I've spoken to him on innumerable occasions, he talks about the process on which he uncovered what he saw was a phenomenon where he first noticed some rather outrageous press articles suggesting that Muslims were intending to do away with Christmas or taking over our schools. And he thought they were quite shocking headlines, and he decided to cut them out and put them in a folder and keep them to look at them later when he wasn't so busy. And he continually found himself doing this, and he noticed that his folder was quite large, and he realised this was a bit more of an epidemic. And I think, for those of you who've seen the documentary, will realise that what he discovered was that, as I suppose Baroness Varsi has recently tabled, that Islamophobia had become an acceptable dinner table entity. So we are finding ourselves in the whole issue of the representation of Muslims in the media, and in particular Muslim students. I know that BOSIS has been at the heart of that, confronted by broadly a media which is hostile to Islam, hostile to Muslims. This has been exaggerated, obviously, post 9/11 and 7/7. And I find it fascinating that the universities entity which you represent were at odds with Lord Carlisle in your analysis of whether or not radicalisation took place at universities. I remember we had Malcolm Grant, who put his head a bit above the parapet back in 2009 after the Al-Muttalib bombing issue, when all the press were determined to promote the idea that Islamic societies and universities were centres of radicalisation, and that there was some sort of conveyor belt leading towards violent action that started off with these societies. I was overwhelmingly impressed that Malcolm Grant stood up and made very bold statements to defend what he saw was the need for freedom of speech. And he said he made a pledge to continue to guarantee the freedom of speech on campus for all visiting speakers at the time. And I want to just quote from something that he said. He pointed with all the fervour that gripped the newspapers about this radicalisation on university campus. He said, "The events in the past few days put all British universities on notice, not only of the need to maintain vigilance against the misuse of the liberties we protect, but also of the astonishing lack of comprehension on the part of some of our news media, and no doubt far more widely about the unique character of universities as institutions where intellectual freedom is fundamental to our missions in education and research. Now, those comments were very bold for a provost chancellor to have made in that current climate, but he made it, and they were echoed again by the Universities Agency when they found that there was no real issue about radicalisation taking place at universities. There were obviously some occasional figures who emerged who were problematic, but this idea somehow that there was a formula that we all understood was proved to be unacceptable and false. I found recently that at Islam Channel we've been involved in a range of symposiums, notably a Global Peace and Unity event, which took place on a yearly basis and then every other year, attracting up to 100,000 Muslims in the UK to the Excel Centre, and to which we invited an array of exceptional speakers from all across the globe. Now, we found ourselves under absolute scrutiny and attack from all corners, with suggestions that the most moderate of individuals were somehow extreme and radical and might be promoting extremism, if not violent extremism. And I want to make reference specifically to a response from Nick Clegg at the time of about 3 years ago, when he was confronted, when he was sent a dossier by a think tank known as Policy Exchange, which many of you may have heard of. He was being urged to boycott the Global Peace and Unity event, as indeed more later he's been asked to boycott a FOSIS event, I think about 18 months ago. And this was, I'm going to read a part of his response. This, he said, is the 4th year of this conference. It will be attended by 30,000 people and is geared towards promoting harmony and dialogue between Muslims and non-Muslims. The policy exchange briefing I have seen seeks to raise alarm over a number of the speakers planning to attend the conference. The accuracy of the allegations is variable, with a notable lack of evidence to support many of the claims. In particular, I was appalled to see evidence quoted from the Society for American National Existence, an organisation which seeks to make the practice of Islam illegal, punishable by 20 years in prison. I need hardly point out how illogical it is to attempt to criticise one set of extreme views by citing another. My concern is not limited to the facts of the document, however. Your attempt to raise a boycott of this event by privately briefing against it is a bizarre and underhand behaviour for a think tank supposedly interested in public debate. Now, I raise this letter because I know that the same Nick Clegg, to be praised for his action then, only a short while ago, since he has become a member of a coalition, made a decision to boycott a perfectly legitimate FOSIS event with the explanation that they were not doing enough to combat extremism, which I found extraordinary. But it's indicative of an ongoing process of demonisation which takes place, of an attempt to suggest somehow that Muslims need always to be looked at through the prism of security and terrorism. Now, I know that just about 3 weeks ago, James Brokenshaw, who is the security minister, warned of the threat of far-right attacks in this country. He said that there are an enormous array of cases. I think 1 in 10 cases refer to the Home Office scheme to stop youngsters being caught in terrorism are related to the far right. 17 right-wing extremists are serving prison sentences linked to terrorism, including a man who built up the biggest arms Cachet, uncovered recently in Britain. 2 men were convicted of preparing to use homemade poison in an attack, and another was jailed for circulating terrorist literature. Now, we do not see any of this appearing as headline stories in the papers. And I found another article by Mehdi Hassan in July 2009 in which he asked these questions. He said that imagine for a moment that Neil Lewington, this was a bomber who was charged with plotting a campaign of terrorism using tennis ball bombs, was a British Muslim. The story would be splashed across the front page of every newspaper in Britain, and Sky News would be rolling a loop of images of his scowling, bearded, dark face. The reality, however, is that you've probably never heard of Lewington, who denies all 8 charges of terrorism because he's not a Muslim, or black, or of Asian origin. He is white, and our gloriously impartial, truth-seeking, colourblind media don't seem to care. Now, the point I'm getting at is that, first of all, there is a discourse which is flawed. A discourse which has no foundation. A discourse which seeks to suggest that free thought in our universities is a conveyor belt towards extremist action, when in fact the reality is that free thought is at the core of a modern democratic society, and that we ought to repel and rebut any such suggestions with as much vigour as we could muster. And I applaud FOSIS for standing solidly at odds with any suggestion that they should modify their practice of encouraging speakers from all around the world to stimulate informed and credible debate. Long may they continue to do so. Thank you very much.